When we think of turbochargers, we tend to imagine their applications on cars and the benefits which they bring, such as increased power without increasing engine displacement, or their ability to increase fuel efficiency. And with these benefits, it's easy to see why so many manufacturers introduce turbocharging to some of their models. But how come we don't really see turbocharged motorcycles? It turns out that forced induction isn't unheard of on motorcycles. We all know that Kawasaki is famous for its use of superchargers on the variants of the H2, and believe it or not, supercharged motorcycles aren't an entirely new thing. The earliest examples being on BMW motorcycles back in the late 1920s, such as the R57 compressor produced in 1928. But what about turbo motorcycles? And what role did Harley Davidson play in their development?
Honda has proven the safety and reliability of its engines and vehicles by winning international Grand Prix races for both.
In the late 60s, the Japanese manufacturers Honda, Kawasaki, Suzuki, and Yamaha, also known as the Big Four, were becoming increasingly popular as they began to develop better and better motorcycles driven by their competition with each other. Consumers loved this, and to further diversify their lineup, Japanese manufacturers began making larger cc motorcycles like the 1969 Honda CB750, which kicked off a race between these manufacturers to make the best motorcycle in this higher cc category. And other manufacturers followed in Honda's footsteps with bikes such as the 903cc Kawasaki Z1 made in 1973. These motorcycles became quite popular among enthusiasts, but not everyone was happy with this. You see, before these Japanese manufacturers began making larger cc bikes, Harley Davidson had the entire US market share of this class of motorcycle. And when Japanese manufacturers began producing these bikes, Harley Davidson sales immediately began to fall, especially since competition between the four Japanese manufacturers forced them to keep prices low, giving customers access to heavyweight motorcycles at an affordable price. But by the late 70s, Harley Davidson was fed up, and they presented evidence of how Japanese manufacturers were selling some of their motorcycles cheaper in the US than in other countries. And Harley Davidson wanted the government to intervene to help them out. And the government actually agreed with Harley Davidson that their evidence was valid, but they declined to do anything to help out. And the Japanese manufacturers continued to run circles around Harley Davidson. And problems became worse when Yamaha introduced the Virago 750 and 920 in 1981, a bike which I've been lucky enough to ride. This bike featured Harley enthusiasts' beloved V-twin engine configuration, and these Virago 750s sold like hotcakes, and the situation for Harley became dire. But finally, to save themselves, executives at AMF, which owned Harley at the time, made a plan of action to save the company from their plummeting sales. But to do this, Harley needed time to get back on their feet and catch up to the Japanese manufacturers. And finally, on April 2nd, 1983, their call for help was answered when the Reagan administration imposed sharply increased tariffs on imported motorcycles over 700 cc's of displacement. And this spelled the end for Japanese manufacturers. Except it didn't. In fact, after the tariffs, the Big Four immediately got to work. They reduced the displacement of their higher cc motorcycles to just under 700 cc. And to minimize performance losses, many of these bikes were outfitted with new technology to ensure that they would still be competitive motorcycles. And these new bikes, which are just under 700cc, were given a name. They were called Tariff Busters. And this new category included motorcycles like the 1983 Honda V45 Interceptor, which went from 86 to 81 horsepower following the reduction in its engine size. And other examples include bikes like the Suzuki GS700, Yamaha XV700, and the Honda 700cc Sabre, all of which remained viable options to consumers even with their reduced engine displacement. But there's just one more idea which the Big Four were experimenting with during this time. A new technology which could increase the power of an engine without increasing the size. And this would be perfect given that these manufacturers were limited to just 700 cc's to play with. And as you may have guessed, we're talking about turbocharging. The first turbocharged motorcycle appeared before the import tariffs in 1978 when Kawasaki had some of their Z1s outfitted with a turbo system, resulting in the Z1R TC. And this immediately piqued interest of many enthusiasts. But this bike revealed some of the issues that a turbocharged motorcycle might face, such as unreliability, but more significantly, how dangerous they could be. Why? Because of turbo lag. You see, on a motorcycle, turbo lag can prove to be very dangerous because it's unpredictable, especially if you hit boost going around a corner. But despite these issues, the Japanese manufacturers were interested in the concept, and Honda was the first to take a stab at it, and they wanted to do it right. So in 1982, they released the new CX500 Turbo based on their existing CX500. And this bike was a technological marvel, not only for its turbocharger, which bumped its horsepower from 48 to 82, but because it featured electronically controlled ignition and fuel injection, which was groundbreaking for a production motorcycle in 1982. And Yamaha was the next to jump on the trend with the XJ650 Turbo produced later that year, which didn't have nearly the same quality as the CX500 Turbo. The next year, Suzuki joined the race with the XN83, which proved a complete failure. Despite the setbacks, Honda and Kawasaki wanted to give the turbocharged motorcycle an honest shot, and Honda released the refined CX650 Turbo, which attempted to solve some of the issues which their previous model faced, such as turbo lag. And finally, Kawasaki produced what many believe was the best attempt at a turbocharged motorcycle, which was the GPZ 750 Turbo produced in 1983. Which strangely enough, exceeded the 700cc limit of the new import tariff. Despite their best efforts though, by 1985, there were no remaining turbo motorcycles in production. And the question often gets asked, why did these turbo motorcycles ultimately fail? Or why don't we have turbocharged motorcycles in production today? And there's actually several reasons for that. First is that the technology on naturally aspirated motorcycles has advanced a lot throughout the last decades, and naturally aspirated motorcycles have gotten fast enough that they don't need the extra power of forced induction. And the second reason is that NA motorcycles are much simpler and cheaper to develop and produce. The third reason is that turbocharged motorcycles tend to be less reliable. And the final and most significant reason is that despite their best efforts, none of these manufacturers were able to reduce turbo lag enough to make these bikes safe to ride. And as I previously mentioned, turbo lag on a motorcycle can be incredibly dangerous because it's hard to predict and control the sudden surge of power you'll get once you hit boost. And if you miscalculate this while passing a vehicle with oncoming traffic or during a corner, the result can be fatal. Despite the ultimate failure of turbocharged motorcycles, the idea of forced induction hasn't been abandoned altogether. Kawasaki has the supercharged H2 as well as all the other versions of that bike, but there's actually more good news. 42 years after Honda released the technological marvel of the CX500 Turbo, it looks like they want to do it all again. And maybe this time, it might work out. Just recently, Honda released the new V3 concept, which would be a groundbreaking motorcycle if it makes production. The concept features a unique V3 engine, a V3 engine, and a new type of forced induction, which Honda calls an E-compressor, which is essentially an electronically controlled supercharger, but unlike a turbocharger or supercharger, its power isn't dependent on engine RPM, meaning that it won't suffer from lag, and the boost it creates can be computer modulated to be predictable and safe. While we'll likely never see a traditional turbocharged setup on a production motorcycle ever again, it is interesting to look at the times when Japanese manufacturers did toy with the idea. And it'll be interesting to see what options the future holds for forced induction to motorcycles.